What's up, man? I like that shirt. All right, ready to get going? All right. How y'all doing this morning? Okay, so this is a pretty fun week for us in Berea. It's a little bit like the first week of school. We have all of our players, or most of our players, back in the building, get a chance to work with the coaching staff to lay a really strong foundation this spring that'll hopefully catapult us as we enter the fall. The other aspect is it's the week before the draft. We're doing our final preparations with the board strategically, getting ready for next weekend. So before I open it up for questions, I actually want to start with a number of really thank yous, and it really starts with our college scouts. I know you guys hear me thank our scouts, really every time with the pre-draft press conference, but I think it's really important that those individuals who are behind the scenes in a relatively thankless job get their due credit publicly. These men and women, they spend a ton of time away from their families, a ton of time in hotels. They really grind to scour the country to identify as many players as possible that fit us here in Cleveland, and getting to know them as both players and people. And they just really make a ton of sacrifices for us organizationally. So I want to say thank you to that group. Also say thank you to our research and strategy group that does an excellent job of really integrating all of our information across a number of different perspectives to help us as we build the board. And I also want to say thank you to our coaching staff. They do a really nice job of identifying developmental areas, for certain prospects, and really identifying how they will be utilized if they were members of our team. And I'd actually like to just highlight, Bubba and Jim. I think it can be easy to maybe underappreciate how hard it is when you're transitioning to a new team as a coach, when you are getting to know a new staff, you're implementing new systems, you're trying to get prepared for the players who are back in the building, and then on top of that you have some personnel work as well. But the whole coaching staff did a really nice job for us. I wanted to highlight Bubba and Jim, just given the fact that their first few months on the job have been a bit of a sprint. So with that, I'll open it up for questions for everybody's favorite press conference, where you ask questions and I barely answer them, but we'll try and do our best this year.
Changing this year, you're going to divulge all your plans, right? In terms of your off-season free agency, how much in what you were able to add and address, how much did that shift your priorities heading into the draft?
Tom, it would be disingenuous to say that it doesn't have some impact. But we do really look at those two ways to acquire players, a little bit differently. Certainly free agency is about, filling immediate needs. The draft, we look at it as more longer term planning and ultimately trying to maximize talent. And I think especially when you're in the situation that we're in, where we're picking, later in the draft respectively, it's not like we can really dictate it. When you're at the top of the draft, you can dictate it to a degree. And so I think it's important for us to be really to remain flexible and make sure that like our first priority is maximizing the talent we can add to the team.
I know you always have a long-term vision, but isn't it about now, given what the moves you guys made last year and then the expectations for this coming season?
I think, probably every general manager, in the sport, you has to really, and you've heard me say this, have a foot in the present and a foot in the future. And that really won't change now. Maybe how much of your body is leaning present versus future, may change as either your team matures or ages out, or if they're really young. And certainly we believe we have a group of players that should allow us to be competitive in the fall, but that doesn't mean that you punt or don't consider future years in your planning.
Update us on the Perry and Winfrey situation.
Yeah, so Jeff, that's it's a pending legal matter, so I won't comment specifically on that, other than to say that Perion understands what really our expectations for all players, whether they're on the field in our building or away from the building. But with it being a pending legal matter, I'm not going to comment too much on it.
Can you just say whether he's here?
Yeah, so we haven't made any changes in terms of his roster status or anything like that, but I'm not going to say anything further.
Is that something you consider when there's an allegation like this, Andrew? And is it something that you'll still consider depending on what other information comes out?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but we'll deal with that matter internally and make the appropriate decision for the organization.
Looks like you addressed, from the outside, all your starter needs, across the board. But can you count on rookies, depending on where you're drafting, to fill up some of the rotation or depth needs, or do you feel like you could still do more?
So I would, one thing to say, like Bill Polian always used to say when I was a scouting assistant, your needs today aren't your needs tomorrow. So I don't know that I ever feel, really settled in terms of addressing needs. Ideally, you want to be in a position as a roster where you're not relying on rookies to have major roles. Now, look, every roster in the NFL will have strengths and weaknesses. There's no perfect roster, and there are going to be spots where maybe you rely a little bit more on younger players than organizationally you desire. But we really want to make sure that as we're in maybe this life cycle of the team, we're in a position where younger players can maybe integrate into the NFL and develop in the NFL at probably maybe more of an appropriate pace.
You're not picking until round 3.
Mm-hmm.
How much did you learn from the process going through it last year? And, how much do you feel like you're better, even not to say you weren't prepared last year, but you're even more prepared this year?
Yeah, I think it's less about like a reflection from last year necessarily, Daryl, and I think the circumstances for why we're picking in, why our first pick, at least as of today, is in the 3rd round are different. Last year, we felt compelled to move back because we liked the group of players, obviously starting with Martin in that range of the draft, and we thought we were able to pick up additional assets that that would help us from a volume perspective with that draft. And this year we were opportunistic at the wide receiver position. I can't say that like we went into this season saying that we weren't going to, or into this offseason saying that we were going to have a 2nd round pick. I can't say thought that even last year. So maybe the learning, so to speak, is just about remaining flexible and open-minded as things develop, because we want to be organized and have a plan moving forward, but plans change, and it never goes 100% according to plan. And if you don't have enough flexibility or ability to pivot, you can't be too dogmatic and too stubborn, because then you're going to be in a tough spot.
Compare the talent level right now of the team overall to when you first got here in 2020?
We're pleased with the progress of the team, Jake. I wouldn't say otherwise. I think we like a lot of the guys that we've added over the past couple years, and feel fortunate to have been able to retain a lot of the guys that have grown over the past 3 years. I don't know that I have a direct objective comparison for you, to be honest, just because quite honestly we haven't hit the grass yet. But I think all 32 teams are probably pretty optimistic at this time of year. We certainly are, with the group of individuals that we currently have in the locker room, and view this upcoming week as a chance to add to that group.
Do you feel 5 defensive ends are enough to go into camp with?
No, I would expect us to add more to that. Look, we're going to get to 90 eventually. I can't say if that's going to be on draft weekend or in May or in August, but I would expect us to add to that room.
Are you ruling out veteran?
I wouldn't rule out anything. I think one thing I've been pretty consistent about, Tony, is that any way that we can acquire someone who can help the team, that we'll be open-minded to, as long as it matches our priorities and it matches the resources we have at our disposal.
We had trades during the previous drafts. How much of that is like, this is how we want to run the draft, and how much of it is you just made a call or got a call and it came together?
Honestly, it's a little bit of a mix, with both. There have been certain points where we've thought, based on what we anticipated the board to look like, where we might have been looking for an escape hatch or, been maybe interested in trading up. But there are plenty of other situations where it's like, okay, we have a player that we like, and then you get a call a couple picks away, or on Friday or Saturday, morning or early afternoon. It's like, hey, here's an opportunity that we had discussed in generalities when we were doing our strategy planning, but we didn't necessarily anticipate would actually come available to us, and then you consider it a little bit differently.
When you go in, Andrew, when you go in for like Deshaun, I mean, you're going basically all in there. To me, when you're drafting third round down, these, like you said, those kind of long-term things, how do you feel about those immediate needs that you had to address? And if you could talk about a couple of the players that you picked up in free agency. And
yeah, we like the group of guys that we brought in. I guess I'll start with the defensive lineman. Dalvin, we think he has a very well-rounded skill set to really anchor the middle line of scrimmage for us. Scheme versatile player that has played in an even front, has played in an odd front. We really like the fit with us. Obo, he's a athletic, quick, speed rusher for us that really fits the mold of players that we like at defensive end. Juan, who we signed, classic free safety, cornerback round, good ball skills. Obviously has played with a really strong secondary in Kansas City. Look, there are a number of guys that we added to the receiver room. Whether it's Marquise Goodwin, who adds vertical speed for us, Elijah Moore, who we traded for, that we think has a very diverse skill set, really excellent hands, and Jordan Akins, who he's a really good tight end that we think can be a mismatch in the passing game. And I know I've mentioned a number of guys. There are some that I'm probably not necessarily highlighting, but
with the receivers, the tight end, does that allow you to maybe open things up a little more on offense?
I think it's like the more skill sets that you have with your pass catchers, the more diversity that you can add to your offense for sure. We are excited about the group of playmakers that we currently had. That doesn't mean that we can't add to it over the coming months, but we think we have a good group right now.
It's been reported by websites that you had 3 quarterbacks come in on their 30 visits. What's the feeling behind that, and how interested are you in adding to the room?
So I guess, number one, 30 visits in general for us, Tony, it's about accumulating more information. So I think that teams use them in different ways, and for us, as we think through what usually ends up being about 125 guys on the board, we just want to make sure that we have everything on all the guys, because you just don't know what the possibilities are going to be that the individual falls to you. Certainly with quarterbacks, we like to spend a lot of time with them, we try and do that appropriately over the course of the spring in different venues. To your specific question about adding to the room, it's the most important position in sports, and no different than adding depth and competition at receiver or D-line or corner or linebacker or offensive line. We're going to do the same thing at quarterback.
Been very steadfast in your time here with the draft and develop philosophy with your young guys. I think you've only cut 1 draft pick over the last 4 off seasons here. Does this roster have room, the 53-man roster in your mind, have room for 8 rookie draft picks in it, with just where this team is right now?
Daryl, I don't know that I could make that comment today. I think hype, like in generalities, yes, if they perform. But I think each year's a little bit different in that regard. And honestly, like, who knows? Like, you get wiped out because of injury in camp, or a guy surprises you in either direction. It may change how you think about adding you to the roster. So we don't really go into it with the mentality of okay, like, can 7 or 8 guys make the team? How does that dictate the draft strategy? And look, I mean, last year we entered the draft with, I believe, 7 picks and ended up with 9. There are some years that we start off with 7 and ended up with 6. So I think a lot can happen between certainly now and the end of the weekend, but also now and the start of the season.
In terms of your running back position, with Kareem being gone right now, how do you view the room? How do you view drafting one even at 74? And also, has the door completely shut on Kareem coming back, considering he's still out there?
Yeah, I'll answer your last question first. I don't know that we've necessarily shut the door on anything. I mean, we look, we're not playing games till September, so we'll remain open-minded to anything that can help the team. You know, we like the room that we have. You know, obviously Nick leads it. Pleased with Jerome's progress over the last year, and you know, John, Kelly, McCreary, you know, Dimitri, you know, taking reps there. We feel like we have a variety of skill sets that wouldn't exclude us from adding someone this upcoming weekend, you know, at that position. But we just got to see how the board shakes out.
Sorry. When you make a trade like you did for Elijah Moore, what kind of factors do you weigh in making that decision to give up that pick or essentially move back?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Dan. I think there are a couple things. I think you know, certainly in no particular order, positional value and need, right? Does it actually you know, fit with how your roster is currently constructed? The scarcity of the skill set for the particular player. And then I would say like both the resource cost and the financial cost. And for us with Elijah, we saw a guy who was a 22-year-old receiver, could separate, had speed, good hands, would fit his skill set would fit a need that we thought we had on the roster. And you know, he's still on his rookie deal, and you know, we thought the draft pick compensation was appropriate while still maintaining our volume in 2023. So we thought it was a good fit for us, a good opportunity for us. You know, like I've mentioned before, I can't say that we foresaw that maybe coming into January, February, but it was just a place where we thought we could be opportunistic and match resources to opportunities.
Coming to the tail end of that extra COVID year, a lot of kids college guys had. How has that impacted sort of the way the lens through which you evaluate guys, especially on the older end of the scale?
Yeah, I think we had talked about this maybe a little bit at the combine, where you know, age isn't the end all be all. We try and make sure that we apply context to any player on our board or any player that we may draft. So we wouldn't necessarily treat, you know, a COVID senior in the same way that we would, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. Each situation is specific to the person. So I guess maybe long-winded way of saying that we take it on a case-by-case basis.
Joshua Dobbs back. I mean, how important was that for that room, especially given his like long-term relationship with Deshaun?
Yeah, I think that was a big one for us. Like backup quarterback, you know, I think as everyone has seen over the past 3 seasons, has been something that we've prioritized. Again, it's the most important position in sports. You know, having Case in 20 and 21, having, you know, Jacoby last year, you just never know. And you know, Josh is a guy that we felt very comfortable with his development last year. We know his makeup. The relationship between, you know, the starter and backup is really important in that room. So we really thought that he really fit like a glove.
Decision on picking up Judd Will's 5th-year option.
Yeah, Jeff. Yeah, I think you know that I don't really talk about contracts or those decisions in this setting. You know, you guys will certainly know before May 2nd, and you know, we're pleased with Jed.
I was just going to say, at linebacker, with so many of your guys coming off of their injuries, we don't really know exactly where like a JOK is right now. But given their situations, how do you feel about where they stand heading into camp? And then also, is that a position that you kind of have to fortify because of that?
All of our guys who are suffered injury at the linebacker room, they've done a phenomenal job with their rehab. We feel like they're all pacing well and appropriately in the recovery from their injuries, and you know, think they're going to be ready to go. And that being said, look, we'll always look to add competition, you know, and that room's not excluded from that. You know, certainly there is historically a little bit of variance in terms of how guys do come back from injuries. We're not naive to that fact, but that all being said, with the progress that those individuals have made, we're very pleased at this point in time.
Up and back, you know, in drafts previously. But given the state of the roster, do you think you're more inclined to trade up from like number 74 than you would be perhaps with a different state of your roster?
It's a good question, Scott. I think it's more situationally dependent on how the board falls, quite honestly, and then ultimately what's the acquisition cost to move up from 74 to the third pick in the draft, something like that. But I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, because we look at the draft more through a long-term lens, we probably in general would be more apt to move back than necessarily move up. But I wouldn't say that we would be exclusively tied to that decision-making thought process.
With last year, not having the early pick, like when did Martin become, like the idea of landing him, when did that kind of crystallize? Was that something heading into the draft, you're like, okay, this is a guy, or was it in day two kind of?
Yeah, no, he was a guy that we had identified as being a player that we certainly liked and being a player that could be around our selection of picks. I think I forget who I was talking about this with yesterday. When you think of a draft board, like, hey, we may have 125 players, and you may like a lot of them, but the reality is the subset of players that you actually end up focusing on is even smaller than that, because hey, look, I love Will Anderson, but and if he drops to 74, we'll take him, but we know that's not gonna happen. So as you think about, okay, who are the players that we really like, could actually be available at our picks, and you would match based on how you value certain positions or certain player risk profiles, whether it's skill set, injury, whatever, all that plays into it. So going back to Martin, he was one of those players for us that even probably before we traded out of 44, that we thought we would have potentially a chance at day two, and that we really liked, and then fortunately just kind of worked out when we traded back.
Off Scott's question a little bit, to where you're at in the roster building process here. In fact, you have 8 picks, where those 8 picks are. Can you maybe have the luxury of maybe taking a shot on a guy more so this year than maybe in years past, as far as your particular draft guidelines that you normally use?
It's a good question, Daryl. Maybe the best way to say, I don't know that I would think of as our roster status as being so unique that we would pivot significantly from, the type of risks that we think are appropriate at certain rounds versus not. I think that's probably the best. Hopefully that answered your question. I think that's probably the best way I can articulate it.
You always like to kind of use that need agnostic phrase when describing the offseason. But I mean, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, with you address some of these needs in free agency, like, do you guys feel more free to kind of go after the guys you really like now, or does it not change the philosophy at all? Do you think?
I think we would approach it. I don't want to suggest that it's like literally you operate in a vacuum. Like there is some interaction, but it's not so much that, or like our belief has been, it's not so much that. Look, you want to come out of the draft with good players, unique players, special traits, and that's like the overarching philosophy. Because I think the reality of it is, if you're in a position where you're looking for a rookie to fill a need in year one, like that's really not an ideal position to be in. And I think probably every roster in some degree does have some of that, because there are only so many players, and you have fixed resources. But we want to try our best to make sure that we're not in those spots. So we don't want to be so rigid that we end up passing up a good player just because we think we can select a guy that can fill a perceived need, or the perception that the individual can fill a need.
When you look at Andrew, when you look at, say, 3rd, 4th, 5th rounders, what percentage of those guys actually become NFL starters? And you could define it, I don't know, 30 NFL starts or something like that.
It's actually a very small percent, and I won't quote the exact percentage, but it's a very small percent. You're probably a little bit more inclined to get, let's say rotational players or high level backups. Now that's not to say that you don't shoot or try and organize your board for, or organize the amount of draws that you can have for more than that. But it also probably is a reason for us where, as we get into, let's say, the middle rounds or the later rounds, we really do look for individuals or players that have, unique characteristics, whether it's a skill or a trait. My scouts will laugh. I'll tell you the story. We always talk about horses versus goose, and goose, it can walk, it can fly, it can run, but it kind of waddles when it walks. It doesn't really fly really high, and it doesn't run real fast. A horse, it can't swim, it can't fly, but it's a really great runner. And it's like, okay, if we were talking about players later, which we would take horse traits. We call them horse traits. Because it's like, okay, hey, if we're putting together a roster, we'd ideally like a player that can be above average in some way, even if it's a very narrow sense. Because then when you put together the team, the aggregate allows you to, maybe to cover the skill set you have. And maybe a perfect example of that would be in the receiver room, right? Like, Marquise Goodwin's, he's a smaller guy, but he's got, elite speed and really good tracking ability. Donovan Peoples-Jones, he's a bigger, stronger receiver. Maybe not quite as fast as some of the others, but he's got great hands and great size. And you can combine those skill sets within that position group and, give yourself enough diversity in the offense to execute a number of different concepts.
Is it for Jakeem Grant to return, to come back and be your returner this year, or do you have to be thinking about that spot?
I think it's very realistic. No different than offense or defense. We would add competition in the kicking game. I would really like to commend Jakeem in terms of how he's approached his rehab since last August. He stayed in the building all season. He's been, he may sleep at the building, honestly, and he's doing really, really well. And I know all of us are optimistic that he'll be back to his normal self, and we're all really rooting for him.
Go back to Mary Kay's linebackers question. To get Sione and Anthony back, I know they still have some ways to go with their rehab, but Anthony, just his communication ability, how key that'll be to installing a new defense, and Sione, the way he kind of took that jump last year.
Yeah, I think, and Anthony in particular, I think everybody who has been around the team understands how important he is in terms of not only his play, but his leadership and communication skills. So I think that one speaks for itself. And with Sione, I think the added experience that he was able to get last season, playing multiple spots and doing a really nice job until he got hurt. The silver lining to the injuries is that we enter this year with more depth in terms of that communicator spot. So we're very excited to have both of those individuals back on the team.
Why are we cold with you, Chris?
You talked about risk assessment. When you're dealing with players, and there are going to be various red flags on a lot of prospects for various reasons. How do you handle
that
and
yeah,
what you do,
yeah,
the various.
Yeah, so it's a good question, Chris. I think, we go into being realistic that every player or staff member that we bring into the organization will have different strengths or weaknesses, different professional strengths and weaknesses, different personal strengths and weaknesses. Part of our job organizationally, with the resources we have at our disposal and the support staff that we hire, is to be able to support individuals, and that's not just supporting players through the on-field development process, but ultimately when we get to a point whether a player is successful or unsuccessful on the field with us, we like them whenever they do leave the organization, whether it's 10 days or 10 years, for them not to only have improved as players, but also to have improved as people and professionals. And that's an area where we've invested a lot of resources, a lot of headcount. We're not an organization of perfect people, and we never will be. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we do everything in our power to make sure that people are supported and developed while they're under our watch.